pick up where we left off here in transitioning from the Davidic covenant. Before I do, I just reminded myself, I think I've mentioned to you all that I'm currently have a lead role in the community theater project going on over in Mansfield. The Mansfield Community Theater is putting on Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe on February 18th at the Willie Pig Auditorium, and I'll send an email blast out to everybody on that day at 2 o'clock and 7 o'clock. And I'm playing the role of Mr. Beaver, and my wife is Mrs. Beaver. So I think I'd like to turn it into a fun extra credit project. If you can attend, that would be great. But because for the benefit of all, I'll probably turn it into a watch the movie. If you want to watch the recording, and I'll give an assignment for extra credit based on watching of the movie or going to the live performance. Okay. But if you go to the live performance, I might make it even more sweet for you. So anyway, I'll give more information out to everybody on that. Let's see. Is there one more thing I wanted to say? Okay. Well, let's pick up with 2 Samuel chapter 8, and just cover briefly here as we continue on. We see David, moving ahead with all cylinders firing. This chapter here in the early verses, we won't read them, but we see military victories that are going to come to King David. He's got unfinished business with respect to expanding the rightful borders of the Promised Land. Those unfinished businesses, unfinished tasks left over from the days of Joshua. David starts to take over some of those house cleaning issues. What's interesting in verse 13, I want to read that and bring that to your attention in chapter 8. Right in the middle of all of the pomp and circumstance for David and his triumphs and military victories, we have this. So David made for himself a name when he returned from killing 18,000 Arameans in the Valley of Salt. David made a name for himself. Kind of gets our attention, doesn't it? The idea of making a name for yourself sounds a lot like Genesis 11. Come, let us make for ourselves a name. Back in with regards to the Tower of Babel. It may just be the author saying, well, he's being successful, but it's interesting nonetheless. It might be a little signal. Sometimes we see the biblical authors sneak in a little ping that might grab our theological attention, and it helps us to be aware. David's he's prone to failure. He's not perfect. He's and sometimes from the great heights become the times when we're the most vulnerable. Isn't that true? You come back from that spiritual conference, and that you're just you were at the high point and used mightily, and all of a sudden something happens and your world crashes in. Sometimes that happens to us. So we see the verses 14 and 15. Verses David, he put garrisons in Edom, in all of Edom he put garrisons, and all of the Edomites became servants to David, and the Lord helped David wherever he went. So David reigned over all Israel, and David administered justice and righteousness for all of his people. So maybe we're okay now. The author's putting amplifying the part about David and his being a good king and ruler. He continues in chapter 9. We see him extending kindness to the house of Saul, or what's left of it, in 2 Samuel verses 1 through 3, to Mephibosheth in verses 11 and 13. Finally, we see David defeating the mighty Aramean army here at the end in verses 17 through 19. And so David in verse 17, we move over to verse chapter 10, in verse 17. Notice the emphasis on David leading the charge with his troops. He gathered all Israel, crossed the Jordan, came to Halam, and the Arameans arrayed themselves to meet David, and he fought against them. The Arameans fled before Israel, and David took out 700 charioteers of the Arameans horsemen struck down Shobach and the commander of the army, and he died, and the commander of the army died there. So this is pretty, militarily speaking, a high point for King David. We may make the case he just had this spiritual high point with regards to the Davidic covenant. And so we see David's leading the charge, and all things are going well. And what's a successful king to do after this great spiritual high and this great military victory high, and all cylinders are firing in chapter 11, right? Let's see. I don't know. Let's see. Let's read this, verse 1. See, is Benjamin here? There you go. Why don't you read for us verse 1 and verse 2.
Then it happened in the spring, at the time when kings go out to battle, that David sent Joab and his servants with him and all of Israel. And they destroyed the sons of Ammon and besieged Rabbah. But David stayed at Jerusalem. Now when evening came, David arose from his bed and walked around on the roof of the king's house. And from the roof he saw a woman bathing, and the woman was beautiful in appearance.
All right. Well, you're probably familiar with a lot of the details of this passage. And let's go ahead and keep reading here and down through until I tell you to stop. Verse 4. Verse 3.
So David sent and inquired about the woman. And one said, "Is this not Bathsheba, the daughter of Elon, the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" David sent messengers and took her, and when she came to him, he lay with her. And when she had purified herself from her uncleanness, she returned to her house. The woman conceived, and she sent and told David, and said, "I am pregnant." Then David sent to Joab, saying, "Send me Uriah the Hittite." So Joab sent Uriah to David. When Uriah came to him, David asked concerning the welfare of Joab and the people in the state of the war. Then David said to Uriah, "Go down to your house and wash your feet." And Uriah went out to the king's house, and a present from the king was sent out after him.
One more.
Okay. But Uriah slept at the door of the king's house with all the servants of his lord, and did not go down to his house.
So this account just amplifies and screams of a contrast, and it's shocking, of course, not just because of the immediate sin, which gets all the attention and focus, him sinning with Bathsheba and the sin of adultery here, but if you also unpack this with regards to the idea of loyalty, who's loyal to who? And you see there in the details, look at verse 8, when David says to Uriah after he calls him to the scene, what I think David is trying to do there, go wash your feet and go down to your own house. Because if you, have sexual relations with your wife, then the baby will be yours, see? You see the cover up here? But he's loyal to his commander, Uriah. He's sleeping at the doorsteps of the king's house. He refuses to go down to hang out with his wife because he's loyal to David. So you see the contrast in loyalty here. And if we remind ourselves of a few things here, we'll get to Deuteronomy 17 here. But this disloyalty idea, David just demonstrates disloyalty, I would argue, to his troops. He's staying behind. Any good king should be loyal to his troops and be with them on the battlefield. Man, I just have to talk about last night's game, Mr. Tom Brady, who I have over the years come to kind of have a low-grade hate for, not in a mean way, but because I've always been an Indianapolis Colts fan, and all the games that Brady has knocked the Colts out of the playoffs over the years, and with Manning during the Peyton Manning glory days and all of that, it was amazing to hear the backstory of last night's game. Tom Brady, and you saw, if you watched the post-game hoopla on the field, his mom was on the field with one of those cancer masks. And Brady said before the game, he was interviewed, and he says, I'm playing this game for my mom. you know. And what happened was, I think last night, I want to cry. If I talk about this, it's almost unlike me to cry about the Patriots. But anyway, lightning will strike. You heard some of his players interviewed. I know this chokes you up because you're a Dallas Cowboys fan. I'm sorry. You got the shirt on right there. No, seriously. Some of his players came out and said, we know that Tom's playing for his mom and we're playing for Tom and his mom. You know, his players were loyal. And they I don't know where they get it. They're not, many of them are just, some of their superstars were on the sidelines, and some of these guys who are really known names show up and break records, you know, Super Bowl records in one night. How does that happen? You know, you've got a team, and one thing you have to say about Tom Brady, there's something about playing for him that any of his players rise way, way above, a few notches above what they'd normally probably play at on any other given team, I think, in the NFL. He does something about serving him, and he somehow gets the loyalty out of his players in a way no other quarterback seems, well, he just is in a league above any other quarterback from that respect. And, you know, David's a king. He's got an army, he's got commanders, and loyalty to be demonstrated. He's got these troops who've been loyal. Obviously, Uriah is demonstrating this kind of loyalty. And we'd expect David to act differently. So this disloyalty to his troops, his disloyalty to Uriah by sleeping with Bathsheba. He demonstrates disloyalty to Uriah, who remains loyal to David to the end by having him now, we find out, sent out to the front lines to face a high percentage of certain death. And then David demonstrates infidelity or disloyalty to his Lord. So if we remind ourselves, I know I might be sounding like I'm being really hard on David, but if we remind ourselves of Deuteronomy 17, you remember the prescriptions for a king that comes from Moses. Don't amass wives. You might make the argument that here David he's on the conquest of somebody else's wife. We have him being disloyal to the Lord with regards to a violation of Exodus 20, verses 14 and 15, unjustified murder, and cover-up, and then adultery, of course. That's Exodus 20, verse 13 and 14. So there's a lot of different layers here of King David being presented here with an exclamation point behind his warts, with the idea of being presented warts and all. This is certainly one of the low points for King David that we have. And one of the things we have to ask ourselves is, we've talked about King David being the wholehearted king in terms of the evaluation of the three kings of the united monarchy: Saul, the no-hearted king; David, the wholehearted king; and soon to be Solomon, the half-hearted king. Where do we see in this scenario the wholehearted king of King David shine through? Anybody know? Yeah, what do you think?
His response to when Nathan comes to him and goes, "Hey, let me tell you the story about this man who had a lot of sheep, and this man over here who didn't have any sheep, and the man who had a lot of sheep had company coming, and so he took the sheep from the man who had one and killed it and ate it." And David's like, "Well, who is this man? We need to do something about this." And Nathan's like, "It's yours. It's you."
Yeah.
And then Psalm 51 happened.
Yeah, you're spot on. I was glad you brought in Psalm 51 and also Psalm 32. And interestingly, here we have the wholehearted king of King David, and modeling to his kingdom in the midst of tremendous failure, personal failure, writing a song and dropping it right into the hymnal of the worshiping church. That's what a wholehearted king does. Bringing his kingdom and using himself and his own failure to perhaps model to his faithful remnant, the worshiping church of his day, how one should respond to God in the midst of personal failure. Psalm 51, if you want to turn there with me, we'll just look at part of it. You know this psalm pretty well. It's a great psalm to read. for personal reflection, interestingly, in the time of when you need to get your heart right before the Lord. Psalm 51, that's what it does. Be gracious to me, O God, according to thy loving kindness. Loving kindness is the covenant loyalty. According to the greatness of your compassion, blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity. Cleanse me from my sin. For I know my transgressions, and my sin is ever before me. Against thee, thee only I have sinned, and done what is evil in thy sight. So you're justified when you speak, and blameless when you judge. So deliver me, verse 14, from blood guiltness, O God, and thou God of my salvation. Then my tongue will joyfully sing of thy righteousness. Lord, open my lips. It's important for a songwriter to have this. Prayer answered. And open my lips that my mouth may declare thy praise, for thou dost not delight in sacrifice, otherwise I would give it. Which is interesting. David could be down at the temple, bringing in some pretty beefy cows for sacrifice. Boy, I'm just going to sacrifice to the nth degree, but he doesn't do that. He knows that's about the heart. You don't delight in sacrifice, otherwise I'd give it. Thou art not pleased with burnt offerings. The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart, O God, that will not despise. That's the heart of a wholehearted king, right? You can use that for your youth groups and congregations. That's raw Old Testament, but it models the, hate to keep doing it. Well, I'll take this off now. Enough billboarding for today. This comes back to the whole heart with feet, does it not? David's fallen. He's going to get up, and he's going to fill his heart in and allow his heart to be filled to the brim. The concepts that sometimes people come to us and say, I didn't think people in the Old Testament could be forgiven of sin. No, this is real forgiveness, wholehearted walking, and then this is the picture that we see here in King David. So, any questions on that? All right. Oops. Here we go. So let's move on. After this, of course, sin has its consequences. You all know this, and if we go back to 2 Samuel, let's pick up in just briefly in chapter 13. We won't cover all of the details. The chaos starts to kick in a little bit for King David with regards to his own household. And Solomon was the fourth son of David, born to Bathsheba. And in the following chapters, chapter 13, we won't cover the details, but we see the elimination of two of the royal sons in the household of King David. First with Amnon in 2 Samuel 13, and then Absalom in chapter 14 through 19. And in addition to any remaining contenders for the house of Saul, we see as well in chapter 20 and 21. So this is the chaos that ensues. But out of the difficulties and pressures experienced by the king, now he's approaching the end of his life. He writes another song. Let's turn to 2 Samuel chapter 22. And we'll see a few examples from both King David and King Solomon here in a little bit of the end-of-life reflection of one who's had a whole lifetime of walking with the Lord. 2 steps forward, 1 step back in that whole experience. So Psalm 22 is a psalm that focuses on, and it's not in the book of Psalms, but it's right in the middle of 2 Samuel. We sometimes forget some of David's psalms are not all in the Psalms. It's going to focus on the victory of the Lord over enemies, and David's going to express in language similar to Moses, like what Moses expresses back in Exodus 15 in his song, Victory over the Egyptian king Pharaoh. So that's what we have. Let's see, 2 Samuel chapter 22. Let's pick up in verse 5. 2 Samuel 22, verse 5. And let's see, could I have David? David, could you read for us?
Yes, number 5.
2 Samuel 22, beginning in verse 5.
For the waves of death encompass me, the times of destruction overwhelm me. The cords of Sheol surround me, the snare of death confounds me. In my distress I called upon the Lord. Yes, I cried to my God. And from his temple he heard my voice, and my cry for help came into his ears. And the earth shook and quaked. The foundations of heaven were trembling and were shaken, because he was angry. Smoke went out of his nostrils. Fire from his mouth evolved. Coals were kindled by it. He bowed the heavens also and came down with thick darkness under his feet. And he rolled on, cured and flew, and he appeared on the wings of the wind. And he made darkness canopies around him, a mass of water, thick clouds of the sky, from the brightness before him. Coals of fire were kindled. The Lord thundered from heaven, and the Most High uttered his voice, and he sent out arrows and scattered them. Lightning and routed them. Then the channels of the sea appeared. The foundation of the world were laid bare by the rebuke of the Lord. At the blast of the breath of his noise, he sent from on high. He took me. He drew me out of many waters.
Yeah, a couple more, down through 19.
He delivered me from my strong enemy, from those who hated me, for they were too strong for me. They confronted me in the days of my calamity, but the Lord was my support.
So this is coming from a king who's near the end of his life. He's experienced a lot of these kinds of things personally, firsthand. He's seen the Lord time and time again deliver and protect and all of these things. Over here in verse 44 and 45, just a few more high points. I'll read this one. Thou hast also delivered me from the contentions of my people. Thou hast kept me as head of the nations, a people whom I have not known. Serve me, foreigners pretend obedience to me. As soon as they hear, they obey me. The interesting thing, there's a little bit of recognition here. I think David, he recognizes that his salvation is for the salvation of his people, as the Lord has allowed him. David's view to the nations here, where David serves as the head over the nations. In verse 47 through 51, the Lord lives, and blessed be my rock, and exalted be God, the rock of my salvation, the God who executes vengeance for me, and brings down peoples under me, who also brings me out from my enemies. Thou dost even lift me above those who rise up against me. Thou rescue me from the violent man. Therefore I will give thanks to thee, O Lord God, among the nations, and I'll sing praises to his name. He is a tower of deliverance to his king, and shows loving kindness to his anointed, to David and his descendants forever. You see there, comes back to David's recognition of, I may be on my last leg, but the Lord has ongoing agenda that will be coming through his descendants forever. And so this is what we have in this song. We have a few echoes from earlier songs. The reference to his anointed goes back to Hannah's song, if you remember, in 1 Samuel chapter 2, verse 10. Goes all the way back. The idea, there's some links there to Jacob's blessing back in Genesis 49, 8 through 10. And again in Moses, one of his songs in Deuteronomy chapter 33, 29. So it's David here focusing on the forever aspect of Nathan's oracle as it relates to the promised seed. You remember that seed that was first promised all the way back to Genesis 3:15. The seed from the woman who will come and emerge and, in a sense, take on the opposing agenda with regards to bruising the heel of the serpent, but in the process he himself being bruised. And then we have a final song of David, as if that wasn't enough. We have one more in chapter 23, verses 1 through 7. Let's have, Caitlin, could you read for us? One last song.
Now these are the last words of David. David the son of Jesse declares, the man who was raised on high declares, the anointed of the God of Jacob and the sweet psalmist of Israel. The Spirit of the Lord has spoken to me, and by his word was on my tongue. The God of Israel said, the rock of Israel spoke to me, He who rules over men righteously, who rules in the fear of God, is as the light of morning when the sun rises, a morning without clouds, when the tender grass springs up out of the earth, through the sunshine after the rain. Truly is not my house so with God, for he has made an everlasting covenant with me. He has ordered all things and secured for my salvation and all my desire. Will he indeed not make it grow? But the worthless, every one of them will be thrust away like thorns, because they cannot be taken in hand. But the man who touches them must be armed with iron and the shaft of a spear, and they will be completely burned with fire in their place.
Okay, so here's something that's kind of significant that comes out of this song that I think as we said, the prophets are going to grab onto as a means of encouraging the faithful remnant of their day. And let's remind ourselves, the idea of causing to sprout up, the idea, you see this imagery of growth, the idea of something growing as a result of the Davidic covenant here. Will he not make it grow? That's the question at the end of verse 5. He's made an everlasting covenant with me, so there's this expectation of something. God will cause something to grow. And, in the midst of the chaos, we go to prophets like Jeremiah 23. Let's turn there and just go to a couple of these places. Jeremiah 23. And verse 5. We'll start in verse 4. I'll raise up shepherds, Jeremiah says. The Lord speaks through the prophet. I'll raise up shepherds over them, and they will tend them. And they will not be afraid any longer, nor be terrified, nor will any be missing, declares the Lord. Behold, days are coming, declares the Lord, when I shall raise up for David a righteous branch, and he will reign as king and act wisely and do justice and righteousness in the land. It's this branch, it's this twig, this small plant that will grow, is a reference to this forever ember that's burning, that's called the Davidic covenant. Another place we can turn to is, let's turn to Jeremiah chapter 33, verse 15. Verse 14, behold, days are coming, declares the Lord. Of course, this is the day of the Lord, right? When I will fulfill good word which I have spoken concerning the house of Israel and the house of Judah. In those days and at that time I will cause a righteous branch of David to spring forth. He shall execute justice. So this is a kind of a repetition of what we just read, and righteousness on the earth. Let's turn to a different prophet, Isaiah chapter 4, verse 2. Let's turn there, Isaiah chapter 4, verse 2. This ongoing reference to the branch. In that day the branch of the Lord will be beautiful and glorious, and the fruit of the earth will be the pride and the adornment of the survivors of Israel. It will come about that he who is left in Zion and remains in Jerusalem will be called holy, everyone who is recorded for life in Jerusalem. You can see how this would have been an encouragement to the faithful remnant. The day of the Lord, that's their future. The Lord's not given up on the faithful. He has a future for them on the day of the Lord that's coming. So we find encouragement here too, with regards to this sprout that will grow, and it's part of the divine agenda. All right, well, let's turn to going back to where we left off in 2 Samuel 22. Just a couple things here before we move into and transition to Kings as we wrap up Samuel. An interesting reference here at the end. Immediately after his last song, what's interesting in the placement of everything, we have an accounting of David's mighty men. These are the men, as you know, who followed him around loyally through thick and thin, through all of the chaos. They stuck by King and fought many battles together. And the mighty men, some of their heroic exploits are also listed in the commemoration of the mighty men who are listed here for all to be remembered. What's interesting in here, at the very last, I don't know if you've ever seen this before, but the very last, and perhaps the most heroic of all, who's listed in verse 39? You see? Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, Bathsheba's husband, Uriah. And then 37 in all. 37 mighty men. Uriah is listed last. So that might have something to do with a wholehearted king, even though in the midst of the huge mistake that was made, reminds the kingdom of who should be listed at the top of the list, or the last of the list. But after this, surprisingly, we're not done with King David. Near the end of his life, David does something somewhat unexpected, at the very end. And we have one more round of sin, it seems. This census that's taken, David, at the end of his life. What you're really doing when you take a census, oftentimes in this context, and you're a king, is you're counting your troops. We saw this idea back in 1 Samuel chapter 8. Deuteronomy 17, of course, reminds us that any king in Israel should know that who wins the battles on the battlefield is not how many troops you need. The Lord, David should have known this after years of experience. Of anybody out, any good king would have known this, but here we have David calling for this census. Interesting, the Lord responds pretty intensely to the situation. And in response to this sinful, misdirected choice of David, through the prophet Gad, David's going to be offered three options in response. So David gets to choose. It's kind of interesting. Verse 11 through 13. When David arose in the morning, the word of the Lord came to the prophet Gad, David's seer, saying, Go and speak to David. Thus the Lord says, quote, I am offering you three things. Choose for yourself one of them, which I may do to you. So Gad came to David and told him and said to him, Shall 7 years of famine come to you in your land? Or will you flee 3 months before your foes while they pursue you? Or choice 3. Or shall there be 3 days of pestilence or plague in your land? Now consider and see what answer I shall return to him who sent me. Then David said to Gad, I am in great distress. Let us now fall into the hand of the Lord, for his mercies are great, but do not let me fall into the hand of man. So the Lord sent a pestilence upon Israel from the morning until the appointed time, and 70,000 men of the people from Dan to Beersheba died. So this is the response that King David, and we see his response in verse 14. The plague comes at the hand of God. David picks the 3-day plague. In response, what we see here in verse 14, David says, the Lord's mercies are great. Now what's interesting is we have somewhat of an echo here, I think, of situations like this where perhaps the one who's serving as a mediator appeals to the nature and character of God. We saw that with Moses. Let's turn back to Exodus chapter 34. Exodus chapter 34. And in the context here, what's being addressed is the sin of the golden calf. And right in the middle here we have Moses serving as kind of a mediator, and chapter 34 in Exodus verse 6 and 7. The Lord passes by, and here the Lord is declaring his own character and nature. The Lord God, compassionate, gracious, slow to anger, abounding in loving kindness and truth, who keeps chesed, or loving kindness, for thousands, who forgives iniquity, transgression, and sin. And this is the character of God here that's being proclaimed, and it seems that David acknowledges the God. He acknowledges the God who's slow to anger, the God who's abounding in loving kindness. And in the midst of the pestilence, as it began to impact the people in Jerusalem, we move over to verse 17. There in the midst of the pestilence, David spoke to the Lord when he saw the angel who was striking down the people, and said, Behold, it is I who have sinned, and it is I who have done wrong. But these sheep, what have they done? Please let your hand be against me and against my father's house. And what happens after that is the plague ends. And what we have, it's an interesting thing that what David does here in verse 7. I'm guilty, David says. I'll take the knife. I'll take the hit on behalf of these people. And it's interesting, this idea of David here at the end of his life, standing in this situation, willing to take the judgment and the consequences, to suffer on behalf of his own people. You might make a case to say this somewhat anticipates the king who's going to come, who will be further reflected on in the suffering servant chapters of Isaiah. The suffering servant, the one who will come on the scene, who will come from the line of David, and perhaps even like David in this case, be willing to suffer on behalf of the sins of him. The fact that he's the one who is sin and responsible for suffering on behalf of the people. So it's an interesting connection there. So it seems the author, Samuel, here recognizes the future cannot lie in any earthly king, but must rest on a king who will be so much more. We have all of these anticipations of one who will come down the road, one who will come in the future. And as these kings, as we've said, are evaluated, we're going to have 40 years of Saul, the no-hearted king. We've just completed David, the wholehearted king, and now we're transitioning into Solomon, who's going to be, I'll argue, the half-hearted king. So this is an interesting... Yeah, go ahead.
Pretty off topic, but it's just something I saw.
Great.
In verse 23...
What chapter?
Chapter 23.
Okay.
Verse 8, it begins with David's mighty men.
Yep.
That's always seemed kind of mysterious to me. It seemed very angel-like. This guy Joshua kills 800 people just at one time.
Yeah.
I wonder who are these special people? Do we know anything about them, really, or are they kind of just a mystery? Really tough warriors, or were they God's presence among them?
Oh, that's a good question. Could we have a situation like I'm thinking of Samson.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Or Shamgar. He has one verse dedicated to him in the book of Judges, but the Holy Spirit comes on someone for a particular purpose. In this case, of maybe David's mighty men may have experienced. It's hard to know for sure, but the idea of always being the underdog and yet taking the battle, routing the opposition. We see that time and time again. Where when the Lord comes on, and how's Gideon's army whittled down to practically nothing, going to win the day? Well, the Lord steps in. Something happens that's dramatic. Whether it be empowering a Conan-like, superhero almost, for that time, bringing on the courage and the bravery and all that kind of Braveheart stuff, and all of that. I don't know. Something like that might be going on with some of these guys, because we know that the Lord is winning the battles for them, and although we don't have the specific details of the day of the battle, we see the aftermath here summarized in some of these heroic accounts. So something like that, yeah. It is mystery. Is a mystery. We don't have all the details of the battle, all of the battles, and all of that. So that's probably the best I can do with that. All right. So let's transition now to Solomon. The book of Kings. We turn our page over. 1 Kings. It's going to begin here, picking up with David in old age, and there's going to be controversy in the household of King David. David's oldest son, Adonijah, is going to see his father fading fast, but is going to announce his rightful birthright as the next in the pecking order, with regards to being the next king. So let's take a look at that in chapter 1, verse 5 through 10. And let's see, Benjamin. Oh, you've already read. I've already called on you. Let's have Austin back here. Could you read for us? Chapter 1, verses 5 through 10.
Now Adonijah the son of Haggith exalted himself, saying, I will be king. And he prepared for himself chariots and horsemen, and 50 men to run before him. His father had never at any time displeased him by asking, Why have you done thus and so? He was also a very handsome man, and he was born next after Absalom. He conferred with Joab the son of Zeruiah, and with Abiathar the priest. And they followed Adonijah and helped him. But Zadok the priest, and Benaniah the son of Jehoiada, and Nathan the prophet, and Shimei and Ray and David's mighty men were not with Adonijah. Adonijah sacrificed sheep, oxen, and fattened cattle by the serpent's stone, which is beside En Rogel. And he invited all his brothers, the king's sons, and all the royal officials of Judah, but he did not invite Nathan the prophet, or Benaiah, or the mighty men of Solomon, his brother.
Okay, so you see the division that's already starting to take place here, and kind of this little mini coup attempt. David's going to consult with his wife Bathsheba over here in verse 28, chapter 1. Let's take a look at that. Then King David answered and said, Call Bathsheba to me. And she came in the king's presence and stood before the king. And the king vowed and said, As the Lord lives, who has redeemed my life from all distress, surely as I vowed to you by the Lord, the God of Israel, saying, Your son Solomon shall be king after me, and he shall sit on my throne in my place. I will indeed do so this day. Then Bathsheba bowed with her face to the ground and prostrated herself before the king and said, May the Lord, King David, live forever. Then King David said, Call to me Zadok the priest, Nathan the prophet, Benaniah the son of Jehoiada, and they came into the king's presence. And the king said to them, Take with you the servants of your Lord. Have my son Solomon ride on my own mule and bring him down to Gihon. So we have this response down to verse 35. And Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet, anoint them there as king over Israel. Blow the trumpet, say, Long live King Solomon. Then you shall come up after him and shall come and sit on my throne and be king in my place. For I have appointed him to be ruler over Israel and Judah. All right. So this is charging him as king. In chapter 2, we see David's charge to Solomon. Let's see, Tamar, could you read for us? Oh, she's not here. Let's see. Cole, where are you? Cole, why don't you read for us in chapter 2, verses 1 through 4.
As David's time to die drew near, he charged his son, saying, I am going the way of all the earth. Be strong, therefore, and show yourself a man. Keep the charge of the Lord your God, to walk in his ways, to keep his statutes, his commandments, his ordinances, and his testimonies, according to what is written in the law of Moses, that you may succeed in all that you do and wherever you turn, so that the Lord may carry out his promise which he spoke concerning me, saying, If your sons are careful of their way, to walk before me in truth with all their heart and with all their soul, you shall not lack a man on the throne of Israel.
Well, that's what every father wants to share with his son in his last dying days, right? And, this echoes Deuteronomy 17 again, the kind of wholehearted king David wants for his son. These are the things that I figured out along the way, and he brings emphasis and refers to Moses, and the idea of the heart with feet, I think, comes in here, the emphasis on the heart. So Solomon's going to hear this from his dad as he moves ahead, and then at the end of chapter 2, you see that finally we see the death of King David. And what happens next after this, we're going to see chaos. We come back to chaos. Solomon's kingdom, and chaos ensues and breaks loose. We're going to see Adonijah go from an attempted coup, the attempt to become king even before David's death, and now that the king's died, comes the request for King David. Adonijah asks for King David's nursemaid, Abishag, to become his next wife. So to Solomon, this must have been or appeared as just one more attempt for Adonijah to usurp the throne and at least put himself in the place or presence of king. And we see in verse 22, King Solomon answered and said to his mother, "And why are you asking Abishag the Shunammite for Adonijah? Ask for him also the kingdom, for he is my elder brother, even for him, for Abiathar the priest, and for Joab the son of Zeruiah." So we've got this situation. What happens next is Adonijah is executed, and then Solomon continues to advance the agenda and settle two more scores, one against the priest, Abiathar, whom he has removed from office. We see that in verses 26 and 27. And then finally, the execution of Joab, which seems to be in response to an old score that needed to be resettled. And we go back to 1 Kings chapter 2, verses 5 through 6. And finally, we see the execution of Shimei after a violation of his house arrest, again, and one of King David's old scores to be settled in chapter 2, verse 8. So all of these things are happening. King Solomon appoints replacements for both offices in verse 35. And the king appointed Benaniah, the son of Jehoiada, over the army in his place, and the king appointed Zadok the priest in place of Abiathar. So that's what we have as a replacement. Now that Solomon has all the old political scores settled, he can get down to the business of being his, hopefully, wholehearted king that David had charged him to be, following the words of Moses in Deuteronomy 17. So let's take our next break. Let's come back in about 10 minutes, and we'll pick up where we left off.